Hello there, and welcome to the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. This is season 16, episode 2. We are live with Liam Eagen, one of the most talented and prolific young cryptographers out there, and he's working on a lot of interesting stuff. But before I tell you about Liam, I gotta tell you about the sponsors of the show, Sideshift.ai. Right now, we're also joined by Citrea, and there's gonna be a question about that. Layer 2 Labs, No Ones, and Huddling.ch. Liam, you are working for Alpen Labs right now, as far as I know.
hmm
That's your main line of employment, but you have so many contributions, both academic and also, I guess, freelance ish in the space. You're pretty respected. I've seen you at Monerotopia speaking on stage. They love you for the work that you did on full chain membership proofs. I've seen that you also worked with Jonas Nick on Bulletproofs, and you also have the other project with Jonas Nick and also Robin Linus, and that one is called Shielded Client-Side Validation. We had an interview about that one in the previous season. So my first question for you, I guess, is like a continuation of the previous conversation that we had. We spoke about shielded client-side validation, and it was like this new and exciting paper. I'm curious to know if anything happened to that one or if it's going anywhere.
Yeah, I don't think there's any major updates. Talked with Robin and Jonas a little bit about like actually implementing it, but since we last spoke, as far as I know, nobody has actually started doing that. Um, and yeah, I mean we've been working on it for a while, so I've sort of taken a break from thinking about it. But I think all of us are very interested in seeing it implemented, and Robin was talking about trying to organize something more intentional to actually do that. But I don't know. I don't think the lift is that high. There's like one feature that's missing from a lot of libraries for snarks that would be very helpful in implementing it. But I mean, it's not impossible. It's just yeah, like so no, I think the short answer is no, nothing really major.
Yeah, if you don't remember what shielded client-side validation was, it's basically a protocol that's built on top of Bitcoin, which brings privacy and scalability and also pretty low fees when you're using it.
Yeah, yeah. The headline is it's like 64 bytes of on-chain data for every transaction, regardless of its size and structure. And this allows it to be like a private meta protocol for Bitcoin. And just normal caveats. It requires some kind of bridge to actually work with Bitcoin, the asset. So this is kind of where Robin's interest in BitVM and mine, I think maybe originally came from. Because Robin had worked on a previous idea a little bit previously called ZK coins, which shielded CSV is like a kind of elaboration of and has a similar evolutionary history. But yeah, yeah. So 64 bytes per on-chain transaction and perfect privacy. So
Do you see that happening in the near future and that being a protocol that's actually implemented in Bitcoin as opposed to a research paper?
yeah, I think there's a pretty good chance that something will be implemented. It's uh yeah, yeah, I think so. I think so.
I had this conversation with David Burkett, the creator of Mimblewimble extension block on Litecoin. And he
Mm,
told me that the reason why this stuff never gets added to Bitcoin is because Bitcoiners have weird fascinations with technology and then they discover something new and they move on. And that's why stuff like
oh,
Mimblewimble never made it to Bitcoin. And maybe that's why we don't have zero coin yet, because there's always another rabbit hole to discover. And I'm actually curious if we're gonna get shielded client side validation because I got pretty excited about that one.
yeah. Well, one nice thing about shielded CSV that originally drew me to it is that um except for the bridge part, it doesn't require modifying Bitcoin. So it doesn't require cooperative integration with Bitcoin. It's just inscribing this data into Bitcoin. For the bridge, right? I mean, you could talk about things like Cat or other sort of soft forks for snark verification, basically, which would be necessary for like a trustless um, two-way peg, with the same kind of security you'd get from a snark verifier on Ethereum. Um, but shielded CSV, like by itself, or if you wanted to just use it for stable coins or something, doesn't require changing Bitcoin, which is why I liked it. So
You mentioned Upcat, and this one is pretty popular among cryptographers, apparently, because you can build some really cool stuff like ZK Starks. You can put together, even have drive chains with Upcat. I
I
think
think so.
Super Testnet is the one who did the research on that one.
Mm.
Do you have any opinion on existing proposals to add covenants to Bitcoin? Or do you believe Upcat is not a covenant and should be added separately from this conversation?
I see. Well, I think it is a matter of fact that one can do covenants with cat. So I mean, in that sense, it's a covenant. I know there's that big table that I don't think I added my thing to it yet, but
Yeah, I think it's by the floppy disk guy, 1440000. I think that's
Hmm.
144 million bytes or something.
Well, okay.
He's the one who
Yeah,
made it.
I don't know. In terms of covenant proposals, I mean, I'm biased by I think what I work on and what I'm interested in, which is adding privacy to Bitcoin and also scalability. And so I really want snark verification. Like I want or Stark verification or just some kind of proof that we can verify on Bitcoin. And for me, this like unlocks sort of everything, right? Because you can that snarks have this nice recursive property where you can once you have like this initial lift, you can verify arbitrarily large things inside of the Stark or the snark or whatever it is. Um, so I like I like that, and I think Cat is a way to achieve that, and it's probably cleaner than the BitVM approach, which has a lot of complexity. I mean, because you're working around all of these limitations, and it has this optimistic component, and then building a bridge around it is a lot more complicated, and you know, it would be a lot simpler with Cat. But I mean, I respect people's concerns about MEV or Mevel or whatever you want to call it. But short of that, I don't know. I don't have really strong opinions. Like that's what I want. So things that get there, like cat or big integer arithmetic, would be another thing that we could add that maybe is, I don't know, less controversial. I'm not sure. Or even just regular integer multiplication. All of these things are very appealing to me. But yeah, I don't know. There's like a whole big list of things, and I don't really have intelligent opinions about most of them.
Wait, this is new to me. So, what is integer arithmetic? And
Uh,
is it presented under the form of some sort of soft fork proposal for covenants, or is it something entirely different?
so it right now, Bitcoin script supports 32-bit integer addition. So in script, you can add two numbers, and that's more or less it. I mean, you can do like stack manipulation, and you can do signature verification, and these things. But um, one thing, like previously, before Satoshi deactivated them, there was a whole other set of opcodes that let you do things like multiplication or division or bit shifting and bitwise operations. And so by big integer arithmetic, I mean both adding multiplication, addition, and subtraction, which are already there, and then extending them to support integers that are, say, 256 bits or even larger, right? I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think originally the arithmetic opcodes didn't have a bit limit. So, I mean, we could go back to operating on like full stack elements. So then you could do something like RSA verification, which might be interesting. But if we increased the limits and added 256-bit multiplication, then we could do something like a Groth16 verifier in script. I think it would fit in a block. It is probably worth pointing out that I think 256-bit arithmetic probably also enables covenants in the same way or a similar way to cat. Um, I'm not sure. I think 128-bit arithmetic might not. But certainly if it went all the way up, you could do, because you can do cat with adding. You can just like take something and multiply it by a power of 2 to shift it up and then add it to something else, and then it sort of concatenates the bytes. That's what I mean by integer arithmetic. So any improvement in integer arithmetic would make my life and the lives of people trying to do snark verification on Bitcoin much, much easier. I mean, it's like on the order of 10 to 100,000 opcodes to do one 256-bit field multiplication, which has come down a lot. Credit to a lot of people who've worked on that at Alpen and elsewhere, but is still enormous, right? And if you added this big integer arithmetic, it would be like 3 opcodes or even 1. So be like
You
10,000x.
mentioned the name of Alpen Labs, and I'm actually wondering, what are you guys building? Is it just a ZK rollup, or is it much more than this?
Yeah. So Alpen is making Strata, which is a rollup for Bitcoin. And I'm not like, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I would describe it more or less like a rollup. So we're working as part of the BitVM Alliance, which is this group of companies that Citrea is part of, and Robin and a bunch of other people, to sort of implement BitVM 2. And BitVM 2, for people who don't know, is the most recent version of this BitVM protocol that Robin originally authored and has sort of evolved and has this confusing naming history of like being a bunch of different things, but they're, you know, anyway, BitVM 2 is what people are currently working on. And the BitVM Alliance is trying to implement like a Groth verifier in Bitcoin script, and then use BitVM to build a protocol. So Alpen is also working on the bridge, which the BitVM Alliance is also sort of working on, but it I think conceptually the bridge and the BitVM part are sort of different. So anyway, so we're making the bridge and then also EVM compatible rollup. And in principle, the EVM part is sort of modular. It's not like it's convenient because of how much stuff already exists in that ecosystem, but like the really core component that's missing is the bridge. And once you have the bridge and a snark verifier, like I was saying, it opens up everything. So you can have WebAssembly or even like Liquid or something that ran using the same kind of bridge with more development. But yeah, so I'm not sure. That was a little bit of a weird, windy answer, but yeah, basically building a bridge for a ZK rollup on Bitcoin. And is ZK rollup, caveat, it's not a proper ZK rollup because BitVM is optimistic. So it has this kind of thing where people have to challenge if there's fraud, but it's not the same thing as like an optimistic rollup. So it's like an optimistically verified ZK rollup. It's all very, very complicated. But
I'm not
yeah.
even sure I know the difference between an optimistic rollup and an optimistically verified ZK rollup.
Yeah. Okay, so for people who aren't familiar, there's this class of rollups like Arbitrum or Optimism that are optimistic. And what that means is if I'm the rollup operator, I claim something happened on the rollup. And then if I lied, there's a protocol where you can submit a fraud proof and prove that I lied. or there's an interactive game that we can go through and force me to provide evidence that I'm lying. So these are very efficient and scale well, but they have this problem where suppose I'm running a rollup and the data of the rollup is not available to you. This is called like a data availability fault. So if the data isn't available, then you can't produce a fraud proof, and this creates a safety violation. So data availability faults lead to safety violations for optimistic rollups. The ZK rollup, by contrast, instead of this optimistic fraud game where you have to interact with me and initiate a challenge, I, the rollup operator, proactively prove that everything happened correctly. So even if I withhold the data, and sort of, I'm using the term rollup here a little bit loosely because strictly speaking, a rollup puts the data on the chain, like on L1, so that you cannot have data availability faults. But for a ZK rollup, you prove that the data is correct. So even if you, the challenger, don't have the data, you can be sure that I haven't stolen your money. I can't have a safety fault. But you can still have a liveness failure, like if I don't provide the data or something like this, right? It depends on how the specifics of the rollup are designed. But an optimistically verified ZK rollup it avoids the data availability safety issue of an optimistic rollup by only using the optimistic part to verify the proof. So rather than verifying the rollup optimistically, you're verifying the ZK proof optimistically. And the ZK proof itself is really small. It's much smaller than the amount of data you'd need to verify the whole rollup transition. So even if you don't have the rollup, you can still have this proof put on chain. And this is crucially important for working with BitVM because in order to the way I describe it is like to make data legible to the BitVM sort of game, you have to sign it with this thing called a Lamport signature, which increases the size of the data that you have to put on chain by a significant factor. So like by putting the proof on chain, we take a really small thing and multiply it by a large number. So it's only a moderately sized thing that we have to put on chain, say. We use the optimistic protocol to verify the proof. So you avoid the safety violations and you kind of still have this interactive element. So it's not quite a ZK rollup. It's kind of somewhere in the middle, if you think about it that way.
There's someone in the chat who asked, is it sort of how headers can be used to prove your transaction was in a certain block?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I guess the crucial difference is, well, oh, you mean like in the context of an optimistic thing? I mean, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it more.
Okay. He also added, without seeing the entire block's transactions.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah. So if you don't have there's a sense in which this is related to like the data availability stuff. If you could prove that you have a transaction in a block very succinctly via like a Merkle inclusion proof, but if you don't have the block, then you can't construct the Merkle inclusion proof. This kind of thing, this shape of issue, shows up like all over the place. It's like one of the big UX issues of like privacy coins is the need for the client to keep a lot of data because they have to be able to construct their own proof. Whereas like for something like Bitcoin, well, I suppose if you don't care about privacy, you could always outsource it. But yeah, so anyway, yeah, this data availability stuff is really there's some I don't remember who said it, but there's a funny thing where like snarks turn everything into a data availability problem. because you can validate like as much stuff as you want, but if you don't have the stuff, then you can't make progress. So
Yeah, it is interesting, and I guess this is the reason why, for example, Zcash could not have functioning mobile wallets for a while. They needed to find much more efficient cryptography to be able to not compromise on the privacy for mobile phones.
I suspect, I don't know the specifics of that, but that sounds very plausible. Yeah, yeah. And also phones got better, so I'm sure that helped.
Sure, I'm not sure how much better, but I guess the
The
cryptography also evolved over time.
Oh, definitely, yeah, yeah.
But I gotta ask you this, and let's imagine this scenario where you are at a conference somewhere and you speak about all of this cryptographic research and the fact that you're thinking way ahead in terms of what Bitcoin can have. And you're mentioning ZK snarks, and you're mentioning the verifiers, the bridges, and everything. And someone comes up to you and says, I've heard about snarks in Zcash, and I've heard about data availability in Ethereum, and I heard about bridges also in Ethereum. You're trying to bring shitcoins to Bitcoin. You're enabling shitcoin tech on my holy Satoshi made chain, which is supposed to only function in a way that I can understand and verify with my node and do basic arithmetic if I want to
Mhm.
understand what's going on. How do you respond to that?
Hmm. I don't know if I've actually ever had an encounter like that IRL, so that's nice. But I suppose if I did, um, I think for me, I'm not personally interested in shit coins. I am very much interested in privacy, and I don't, and also scalability, but I don't know. I mean, I've been in Bitcoin and for a while, and so I remember when there was kind of it felt like the dream of a, decentralized, permissionless, maybe even private, although, obviously it wasn't, but internet money was like alive. And that's what I want. I want to be able to do payments and like be private and have cash on the internet. And so um as it stands, that vision is not, I mean, I guess it's a matter of taste, but I feel like we're not living up to that ideal, and we could do more to achieve it. And I think the only way to do that is via snarks, basically, right? So some kind of snark verification. And this is a motivation for working on shielded CSV to make private, scalable Bitcoin payments. And I think that I think there's a certain unbridgeable gap, right? Like people have different views of what Bitcoin should be. So if somebody disagrees with that, then or they like don't want to have scalable private payments with Bitcoin, then so be it, right? I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but I mean, it's not worth trying to convince them. I think that the shitcoin stuff is, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess kind of unavoidable. It's tricky, right? Like, which if it's hard to slice it in a way where you don't end up like enabling some kinds of things that people don't like. And I mean, for what it's worth, it's not obvious to me that the things that I'm interested in actually do much. I mean, we've all seen, right, like ordinals and inscriptions and NFTs on Bitcoin, and nothing has changed to enable that. I mean, people say like Taproot, but I mean, I don't even know if that's true. It's just made it like a little bit simpler, right? So, um, I don't know. I think I'd probably politely try to disengage, but like if somebody is interested in private scalable payments on Bitcoin, then I think that I could probably convince them that this is sort of the only way to actually achieve that, or the most robust way to achieve that.
Well, but they will say Lightning is private or Liquid is private.
Mm, yeah, yeah. I mean, I used to work at Blockstream. Liquid has confidential transactions. It has a certain amount of privacy, but it is also a federation and a side chain, so it's not trustless. And what you need in order for the version of things that I'm most interested in seeing is like a bridge that can operate kind of more like an autonomous smart contract on like Ethereum, right? If it requires interactivity from someone in order to work, that person is vulnerable to, you know, attack by repressive governments, say. And without that, your privacy is not guaranteed. And Lightning privacy, I mean, it's true, Lightning has more privacy than Bitcoin, but it's sort of, I think of it as fundamentally different. You know, they're, I mean, I'm not a Lightning expert, so I don't want to say anything that's wrong, but I think that the kind of privacy you get from something like shielded CSV is stronger than Lightning, and you're able to do things like cleanly prove that you don't leak any information besides what's leaked via interacting with the network, right? So you don't leak any information about amounts, you don't leak any information about senders or receivers. Um, and yeah, so perhaps there are ways to make Lightning adequately private, but I don't see why one wouldn't sort of strive for the most privacy you could get. Yeah, so it's
Yeah,
also, yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead.
So no, no, I mean, the lightning comparison is interesting because it's like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have anything else to say about that, you know.
Yeah, you said you're not interested in shitcoins, but if you do have any shitcoins, check out sideshift.ai, which is this place where you can swap any coin for BTC. You can be, the most orthodox of Bitcoiners by using Sideshift. You can swap your, XRP, or you can swap your liquid BTC, I think, or you can swap even, I think they support Fartcoin or whatever. So if you somehow receive Fartcoin from someone and you don't think it's a good idea to hold it on the long term, swap it for BTC on Sideshift. The fees are pretty low, and also they have a lot of liquidity for this. And also, if someone pays you in stable coins, don't hold stable coins in a bull market. This is actual financial advice. Don't hold stable coins in a bull market. We're past 100,000 today.
Oh,
Just
really?
don't. Yeah, I guess you
Oh,
haven't
wow.
looked at the price.
Nice.
Anyway, Sideshift.ai. And two other sponsors of the show, and I guess these two come with actual questions that tackle your expertise. They're Layer 2 Labs, which is building the drive chain. Right now, they have on Signet a bunch of actually working software for various sidechains. So you can try an Ethereum sidechain, you can try a Zcash sidechain, you can try a Namecoin sidechain, and also something with prediction markets. You can test to see how they interact. You can send coins between the various clients that you're running on your computer. And I think they have these test versions of the software on macOS, Linux, and Windows. So you can pretty much try on every operating system. So it's not just an idea, it's an actual implementation that you can try today on layer2labs.com/download. And then there's Citrea. And I guess it goes back, and I'm going to ask you about this once I'm done with the ad, but there's this conflict between what's the scaling way for Bitcoin, right? You have the sidechain and you have the rollup. The sidechain has been around for a decade. The rollup is more recent and it comes from Ethereum. But Citrea is trying to build this EVM that also enables you to do advanced contracts and financial services to unlock a lot of this potential for DeFi on Bitcoin. For example, they can help you issue stable coins against your BTC so that you can make payments without actually selling your Bitcoin. Or you can have stuff like Celsius and BlockFi on a protocol level without actually having any trusted institution in the middle. It's just code you can audit. And there are some interesting DeFi applications that can get built on Citrea. And they also have their own testnet version that you can try today if you want to see how it works. And it's citrea.xyz, if I'm not mistaken. That's the URL. I've also interviewed both Paul Stortz and Orkun on the show, and you can search for these interviews and understand more about the philosophy behind the projects. And my question for you, Liam, after all of this talk, is where do you stand in this conversation between sidechains and rollups? Do you believe rollups are a much better way to go, or do you think that sidechains have this untapped potential?
I think you get better, like, okay, so for me, right, I think you get stronger guarantees from a rollup. You don't have to trust the like categories are a little murky, and sometimes people use words in ways that are confusing or potentially incompatible. What I think of as a side chain is it kind of has its own separate consensus system and then some kind of bridge back to Bitcoin. And then what I think of as a rollup is it actually puts the data on Bitcoin or the L1, and then it has some mechanism, some contract or bridge for moving from this like roll up world back to the L1. And so the main difference I think is sort of how you handle um, the data and reorgs. So a roll up should not be able to reorg unless the L1 reorgs. So it gets the kind of like ordering of everything from the L1 because you're embedding all of your data into the L1. So you inherit Bitcoin's probably most like powerful feature, which is finality. Say a sidechain sort of fundamentally doesn't have this. I guess, like I say, you know, in some sense, right? A sidechain is like a bigger category, maybe like rollups or like a type of sidechain or something. But if we think of a sidechain as having its own consensus, then it does not have that. Um, then the data availability issue is also big, right? Because if you're a rollup and you're putting your data on Bitcoin, then you can't have data availability faults. So you can't have safety or liveness violations in the case of a ZK rollup. Um, that has a huge asterisk, right? You need to be able to withdraw if the operator goes offline. So, you know, it's not like a fundamental property, but at least you could achieve this. For a sidechain, I think, again, it's fundamentally not possible. So the advantage of a sidechain, however, is that it scales very well. I think, and it doesn't run into these limitations. So if you try to do a roll up on Bitcoin, right, eventually you're just going to run out of space to inscribe things into Bitcoin. So there's only so much data you can put there. And that maybe you can 100x the number of transactions on Bitcoin, say, order of magnitude, but that's still small and maybe not where we want to be. So the advantage of a sidechain or one of these like intermediate things. So I've kind of alluded to this, but there's also like a Validium, which has sort of commitments to the data that you put on Bitcoin along with proofs, but the data itself isn't there. So that's, at least in the way I'm thinking about things, not necessarily a side chain because you inherit the same, you know, reorg resistance from the commitments, but you also can have data availability faults, unlike a rollup, a proper rollup. And then you've got like a volition where you can choose where you put your data. And so, yeah, all of this is to say, I think rollups are more compelling because of their, you know, better properties, I guess. But I think everybody should do what they want to do and see how it works out, right? Like, uh, yeah, you can have both, like different people doing different things.
I would love to see that, to have an actual competitive market for scaling solutions. But right now, it's like nobody can actually build. We're waiting for various activations to happen. And we're
Mm,
negotiating with each other saying, well, can we get consensus on this one? Maybe
mm.
that other one. oh no, there's a new one right now and it seems to include the previous one too, so can we negotiate on this one instead? It's a bit silly, but I was wondering if you looked into Drivechains, if you have any opinion on the idea and the proposal.
Yeah, I've heard of Drivechains. I'm aware a little bit. I think it's kind of like, I don't know if this is reductive, but you sort of allow miners to vote on the outcome of the drive chain, right? Um, I guess the advantage of this sort of approach is that it's simple, or, you know, the disadvantage is that miners can steal. So it has just kind of a fundamentally different security model. I don't know. I guess it's definitely impressive that they have working stuff and it's implemented, and that's to their credit. But I think that it's possible to get stronger guarantees from something like a rollup, or a volition or something. I mean, yeah, I mean, with the performance increases that we've seen in snarks over the last 10 years, or you go back as far as you want, but we're probably it's probably going to be feasible to prove almost anything you want, right? Or you can run. So I don't know. I think using a snark makes a lot of sense because it will become so cheap that it's why wouldn't you?
Okay, so what do you think about Citrea compared to what Alpen Labs is building? What's the difference?
Yeah, we're I think broadly in this we're sort of direct competitors, right? We're like both building Bitcoin rollups. At least that's my understanding of what Citrea is doing. We're both part of the BitVM Alliance, both doing research on substantially similar things. I think we're actually fairly cooperative. I mean, at least as part of the BitVM Alliance, everybody's cooperating a lot. Um, yeah, in terms of like product offerings, I think maybe there's differences, but I'm not super sure. There's also, I think, I mean, this stuff changes a lot, but there are like subtle technical differences maybe in approach or like how the bridge will work. But I don't know. I mean, yeah, so it's probably not a super satisfying answer, but I've I think they're pretty good. They do good work. They've been nice to me. I like them.
This should not be a criterion, by the way. They've been nice to me, but it's nice when people are collaborative.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's not there's a prevailing atmosphere of collaboration in the Bitcoin L2 space right now, which I certainly prefer. I hope it continues, who knows, but
I remember when the situation was a lot more tense with Super Testnet saying, oh, but these Citrea guys are not even using BitVM and they're not doing a real rollup according to my definition. Citrea
mm,
makes this claim that they have created the first ZK rollup on Bitcoin.
uh,
And
yeah, that's a strong claim. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what Super's definition of rollup is, but depending on what one means by a ZK rollup, I think if you ask them, they probably would concede that it is an optimistically verified ZK rollup or however I defined it previously, because that is what they're doing. It isn't possible to verify a snark on Bitcoin via a smart contract. So calling it a ZK rollup is a bit. I don't know. I think yeah, whatever. Smaller. It's simpler. It's easier to say.
let's take the conversation one step back and ask an existential question like, why do we even bother with this? Why does Bitcoin need any kind of privacy? I think someone on a podcast last week told me that it's perfect money. You should not fuck with the money. It's already perfect. Why bother? You know, BlackRock seems to like it. So why should I care?
I don't know that BlackRock liking it is the criteria by which we should judge the perfection of our money. But I think I don't know. I think of Bitcoin as like alive. I mean it's um I don't know. I mean even in the most kind of pro ossification view of Bitcoin, it will always be alive. Bitcoin is maintained by people. It's software that has to be upgraded to work with the real world. It's composed of people who use it, and there's a social construct element of everybody believing that this is Bitcoin and not some other thing that people want to call Bitcoin as Bitcoin. And so, I mean, I don't know. I think of it as alive, and I also think that it frankly lacks the properties that I'm most interested in, like privacy and scalability. And so, yeah, I mean, I understand where the fear comes from in terms of like you don't want to mess up a good thing, but I don't know. I don't know. I think it's like a mindset shift that's occurred over time. I don't know. I wonder if like we could go back in time and test how people felt in 2014 about Bitcoin and see like if their view of what it would if how they would feel about what it is now versus what I want it to sort of be. Um and there are trade-offs, and I guess everybody's entitled to their opinion. But the reason that I'm interested in all of this is private, decentralized, uncensorable internet money. I think that it should exist, and it's like natural right that people should have it. And I think that I mean, for me, right, like I guess there's an interesting similar question, which is like, why do it with Bitcoin, right? Because it exists to varying degrees in other projects, Zcash, Monero, etc. Um, and I want to add privacy to Bitcoin because it is so like powerful, right? It's the most resistant to being banned. And so if we can add privacy to Bitcoin, then we won't make privacy illegal because there is enough vested economic interest in keeping Bitcoin around. So, I think um, I hope this doesn't happen, but something like Monero is fairly marginal, right? It's not owned by your grandma in her IRA or whatever, but Bitcoin might be. And so the political capital necessary to ban Bitcoin, it may exceed what is possible to muster. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a politician, but this is my hope, and this is why I'm interested in adding privacy to Bitcoin, because it'll be more durable.
This is so beautiful. I'm gonna make a short clip out of that. But there is this tiny Italian guy. To avoid lawsuits, I'm gonna call him Guacamole Zucchini. And he made a presentation back in 2018, I think. And I found this slide from his presentation. It's called The Four Universal Truths. Number one, everything which is not Bitcoin is a scam. Number two, every attempt at changing Bitcoin is a scam. Number three, every attempt at pushing people to spend Bitcoin is a scam. And number four, we shouldn't be nice to scammers.
I see.
I guess
I
it
see.
should be more like, we shouldn't be nice to scammers. It goes like that. But how do you reconcile with the fact that this guy's following is gonna refer to you as a scammer by virtue of this presentation which went viral? Because you're
I
trying
see.
to change Bitcoin, right? You're trying to make it private and scalable.
Yeah, I mean, technically, right? I'm working on Bitcoin as it is, as at least via Alpen, right? So nothing well, I guess I've said I would like cat, but the like BitVM doesn't require changing Bitcoin, and shielded CSV doesn't strictly, right, it's a bit like modularized, so it doesn't require changing Bitcoin. But um, I don't know. Yeah, I guess some people aren't gonna like you. That's okay. But like, I don't think yeah, I guess I sort of just disagree. I think like Bitcoin as money is interesting, is why it was interesting in the first place to me, to the uncensorable aspect of it. And um yeah. I think it's a bit like, if you really unpack the idea that Bitcoin will never change, it's probably um well, I guess the idea that Bitcoin should never change is itself a change to what Bitcoin is. If you include as Bitcoin the um beliefs of the people who constitute the users of Bitcoin. I don't think this was always the case. I don't think everybody has always agreed on that, as evidenced by the fact that Bitcoin has changed. So, like, which version of Bitcoin should it be that we should have and have never changed? However, I will say I think that the resistance to change is healthy to a certain point, and that, like, one should not just change because something seemed cool, right? Like, it should be measured and considered and all of this. But yeah, from my perspective, I want private scalable payments with Bitcoin. So that's the status of a belief, right? And if you think that yeah, I don't know. I don't see how that's a scam, but maybe different definitions of words.
Yeah, the mentality which is borrowed from the open source space, I guess, from the Linux development, is that you have these altcoins for the purpose of testing features which maybe are half baked, or you're not sure what's going to happen on the long term with them. So you
Mm-hmm.
test them, you test Zero Coin on Zcash and Firo. These are the two big ones that are trying this technology right now. There's also Pirate Chain, but it's basically a fork of Zcash, which is trying to keep up. So it's not that innovative. You're testing ideas. I think Monero has bulletproofs and it's gonna get full chain membership proofs, which is
Mm-hmm.
interesting. And it's also useful for Bitcoin. And this was always the conversation, I guess. This was the Bitcoin maximalist talking point, that you're gonna just take the best of what's being developed and put it to Bitcoin. But
Yeah.
right now, the conversation has changed to a point of complacency where we say, well, being a maximalist means just accepting Bitcoin the way it is because it's perfect and it was given to us by some time traveling alien who made sure that we have everything we need and everything else is a scam. And
Mm.
it's very difficult to reach any consensus if you don't accept the fact that there is a need for privacy and for scalability to exist in the first place. And it seems like this lack of improvement is also convenient to centralized services like exchanges, like custodians, and they're taking full advantage of the limitations to come up with the service. So, of course, we're not going to have, without Upcat, we're not going to have proper rollups and covenants and sidechains. So, there's going to be some business that's regulated and KYC AML compliant, and it's going to fulfill all the functions.
Uh,
Granted that you trust it and you put your coins in some custodian's address, and most likely you're going to get rugged in the long term. And then you get people like Luke Dash Jr. who say, at least there's someone to sue, as opposed to having this wild protocol built on Bitcoin where people can steal from you. So it's better for a business to steal from you than a native layer of Bitcoin to do the rug pulling, which is mind
mm.
blowing.
Yeah, I personally don't understand that sort of bit towards the end there of, like, there is a recognition, I think, amongst everybody that, like, if you want this to be used, it will need something more, right? And the idea that using centralized custodial services is an acceptable solution, and either, like, never change anything. I don't know. It doesn't make sense. I don't understand that, because it feels like why even have it in the first place? Like, I I don't, I don't know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, my question for you was going to be, before going on this long rant, the question is, do you believe there is like a reasonable time frame for testing, and after that you can say, okay, this actually works, and we have tried all the possible vulnerabilities, or all the concerns have been obliterated by the existence of this on a live network? Or
Mm.
do you think it's reasonable to say, well, maybe that in 10 years there's going to be someone else who comes along and breaks this?
Um, that's a good question. I think so. There's a certain part of it that's a matter of taste or like opinion. So I I think there's two issues that sometimes people muddle. One um is there some like unknown about activating cat that will be catastrophic or really bad? Um, Whether we can comprehensively rule that out via research, I don't know. I mean, probably not. Maybe. I'm not sure. I do think we can be acceptably certain that there are no unknown unknowns. And the amount of time, I think it probably makes more sense to measure it as like amount of interest, which is pretty high right now. So like interest over time, there's a lot of people thinking about it and talking about it more recently, yeah, say, versus like the very long amount of time that it's not been activated. Um, or like you said, put on testnet or something, right? But I don't know. I mean, I've heard people say like a few years, basically, but I don't know. I guess I'd have to think about it more. But the other point that I wanted to say is that there are um trade-offs. So there are like known potential risks that like cannot be mitigated, that you either have to accept or reject on the basis of. So if you're concerned about having um covenants at all, then you will not be no amount of research will convince you that activating cat is a good idea, because it will enable them. Uh, or if you're worried about Stark, like if you oppose Stark verification, then it's not like a research question, it's a political question, whether or not that should be enabled. Um, so I think that it would be helpful to have more clarity around like whether whether something is worth doing or whether the risks are too large. So like sort of break down people according to that, and then consider things like existential risks, like unknown unknowns, or like another version of this, which isn't exactly the same, is like, will we figure out a better way to do it? Which is a very valid concern. And if you look at the history of snarks, this is essentially what happened. Things have improved very dramatically, and so like fixing something 10 years ago would have been a bad idea. Um, but yeah, I think like for something like cat, say a few years of like intensive research probably will uh, be sufficient to rule out any like major unknown unknowns. I mean, there's also, of course, the risk that there's some sort of weird, I don't know, SHA-1 pre-image covenant thing that's already possible, right? So like we might figure out how to do something weird and bad without changing Bitcoin. And at a certain point, it's unclear that like the probability of that weird tail risk thing goes up with changes, or like it. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know. I think it should be decided by the community. I mean, it's people should have opinions and weigh in, but yeah, at a certain point, it's basically political, and I don't know. I mean, I assume we're not that far off from that. Maybe a year or two.
Yeah, I did have the Collider script. One of the authors of the Collider script paper, Avihu, he was on the
Mm,
show and he spoke about it. And they did figure out how to enable ZK Starks without CAT, but it's super expensive.
mm-hmm.
So not
Yes,
everyone can afford it.
true, true. It requires some sort of weird like SHA-1 collision ASIC that's like $100 million or something to deploy. And uh yeah, yeah. Hmm. I don't know. I think also not enough attention, just personally, not enough attention is given to the like larger risks that come from outside of Bitcoin that like don't actually have anything to do with changing the protocol at all. So for something like MEV, there's always the risk of some kind of meta protocol, like say ordinals and inscriptions or runes or something else that screws up the incentives in a way that similar to having an AMM on chain, which is an example of one kind of Meevil people are worried about. Um, and so maybe like somebody designs a meta protocol that requires you to run some kind of flashbots thing as a miner, and it has all the same negative effects, but doesn't change Bitcoin at all. Is that's like totally outside the scope of these discussions, and so I don't know. It feels like neglected or unconsidered, this risk.
Yeah, my example is usually that Taproot, not Taproot, Segwit was activated just a few months after it went live on Litecoin. And maybe that the times were different and there was more of a sense of urgency to activate something. But now some people are disappointed in Segwit and they say, this one actually enabled ordinals to exist. But on the other hand, it also enabled ZK rollups. And we could never even conceive such an option in the case of Bitcoin if it was not for the tap script and also Segwit.
Hmm. I think another good point to add here is there is, people may not be aware, even more like the whole universe of even more fancy cryptography than just snarks. So people may have heard of things like witness encryption or functional encryption or indistinguishability obfuscation. Um, and people are seriously working on trying to develop a form of indistinguishability obfuscation, which I'll say is, we can think of it, it's not exactly this, but it's basically you can take a program and obfuscate it. So you take this program, you run it through an obfuscator, and you get a black box. And the black box only allows you to run the program. You can't do anything else. You can't inspect the program state. You can't like run it halfway and then see what it did. And so what you can do with this is you can build um, kind of smart contracts on Bitcoin, because you could take a program that contains a private key and obfuscate it. And now you have this block of code, this opaque block of code that will sign things for you, but maybe it has some conditions. So it says only if this snark is valid will it generate a signature. So you can build a signature oracle that doesn't require a trusted third party. From my perspective, if we had indistinguishability obfuscation, it would enable all of the things people are worried about enabling snarks on Bitcoin, plus everything else. And this has nothing to do with Bitcoin at all. In fact, it's probably impossible to stop if you have indistinguishability obfuscation, which currently is a very theoretical and not practical thing. But I don't know. I mean, it makes a certain element of these discussions kind of complicated because it feels a bit like a matter of time, right? Unless something like this is fundamentally impossible, if we have indistinguishability obfuscation, you get smart contracts and rollups and two-way bridges and all of this without changing Bitcoin at all. So
Yeah, there's so much that you can do, but it's not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. And the way in which I look at OpCat and I look at CTV and I look at all the other Covenant proposals, I don't see any personal benefit. And I think that's the biggest issue, right? Because unless you're a developer or you're a company that's gonna finance these layer twos, you're not really incentivized to care about this stuff. But as an end user, I do want that stuff to exist. and I do want scalability and privacy solutions to compete with each other, and I do want builders to stay on Bitcoin as opposed to go to Ethereum. So I do see the value of this, and I do want this to exist because Bitcoin should have this competing market for development, which you don't see too much. There are only a handful of companies which are vetted, quote unquote, and you say, you can trust Blockstream because they're pure Bitcoiners. And then there's someone in the chat complaining right now about Citrea because it brings Ethereum stuff. You can't really win. But it's a good idea to have competing solutions and see where the users are going and get more users to use Bitcoin as opposed to allow them to go to some other chain like Ethereum, Solana, or if they want privacy, go to Monero or Zcash. I don't know how you see this. Maybe that for you it's just the ability to work on something as opposed to just talk about what you can do.
It's certainly gratifying to work on something. I mean, but I agree. I think the benefits that people will see will be privacy and scalability, and that's what I care about and what I hope other people care about too.
Yeah, that was a pretty short explanation, but it's important to keep the builders working on Bitcoin because there was a huge brain drain for a few years to Ethereum because it pays better, and they invested a lot of research and researchers and academics.
Mm.
And I guess you also worked on something related to Ethereum.
Yeah, I've worked with EF people. I also consult with this company Aztec. They're doing an Ethereum rollup. They're using one of my Snark papers that I wrote with Ariel Gabazon. And so they're trying to do private smart contract stuff, but I don't know. I think like the bad blood between different crypto communities is a little bit like I don't personally understand it, resonate with it. Maybe back in the day it was a little bit fresher, but I hope that there's not so much like there the research is shared amongst everybody, right? So something like Musig and Frost. I think Frost was originally paid for by Zcash, or Chelsea's grant was from Zcash, and Musig obviously Blockstream, Musig too, and so I don't know. I want to see collaboration. I want to see people work with Bitcoin. I think there's interest in doing that, and yeah, yeah. But yeah, yeah. No, go
Would you
ahead.
say that Monero or Zcash are scams?
No,
Would you say
I would
that
not.
something like Litecoin is a scam?
I don't think so. No, I mean I don't really follow Litecoin, but I think it depends on what you mean by a scam. People, this is also one of those word definition things that, but like, uh, people people definitely use Monero and Zcash for their like intended purpose, and they have like real communities of people who actually work on them, and yeah. So to equate that with I don't know, FTX or something, which maybe was a little bit more of a like literally a scam, is reductive. Um, I don't know. I mean, I know people object to like different things like pre-mines and the like sketchiness with different projects and how they start and whatever. But no, I don't think that it's not obvious to me that no, I don't think that Monero, Zcash, or Litecoin are scams. Although I haven't looked at Litecoin in years, so don't really know what's going on there.
Well, I think it's more interesting now. I mean, Litecoin, because they have the Mimblewimble extension block, which
Yeah, that's
gives
cool.
them scalability, and they can also increase the block size on the Mimblewimble extension block from now on, so they don't have to work on the base layer to change anything. They can just soft fork and increase the capacity of that one, which is also prunable, so it's not a huge burden on the node runners. Of course, the
That's cool.
privacy is not as good as something like ring signatures or snarks or starks or whatever,
Mm.
but it's pretty good for the purpose of having this money you can spend. And that actually works. So they have this peg and peg out mechanism that lets you pay directly from the extension block to a main chain address. And they also have zero conf, which makes it easy to use in commerce. I mean, yeah, it's philosophically different from what Bitcoin is doing, but
Mm.
I guess there's still something to be learned because Andrew Polstra, and some people when they see you, they think you're his brother, by the way. Andrew Polstra presented this proposal back in 2016 about adding Mimblewimble to Bitcoin with an extension block, but the Litecoin people actually coded that.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, that's good to see. I'll check it out. I think I've heard of this, but I haven't actually looked at it. It's nice to see people using Mimblewimble. That was always a fun idea. Very simple.
There is someone in the chat who says that Citrea is marketing itself as trustless zk VM rollup, but it's actually a decentralized database. A centralized database. And my question for you, because you work for Alpen Labs,
Uh-huh.
and you know a little bit more than either of us, I guess, the guy in the chat and me, about how this works. But is there any way you can make it more decentralized, or would you say that it's unreasonably centralized and it should not be so?
Yeah. So there are different parts of the system that have different variable degrees of centralization. Um, I don't know what the commenter is talking about exactly, but the sequencer, actually, I will say I don't know like what Citrea is doing exactly, but I suspect or hypothetically that they could have a centralized sequencer. And what that means is that there's sort of one party that like executes the rollup. So they take all of the rollup transactions, they sequence them, and then just assume for simplicity that they also build the rollup blocks and that they also construct the proofs for the rollup blocks. So there's just like one person who's doing this. Um, Now, this still inherits the double spend resistance or reorg resistance from Bitcoin and the data availability properties of Bitcoin, but you do have centralization risks from the sequencer. So the sequencer could censor you, and that's bad. Um, Now, there are alternative rollup designs. There's like a very large literature of different rollup designs. And so you don't have to have a centralized sequencer. You could have a network of sequencers that all compete with each other to construct blocks, and they have some kind of consensus mechanism that's used to select which sequencer. It's important to clarify this is not the same kind of consensus mechanism the sidechain would use. It's only used to pick the sequencer. Um, so for example, you could have like minors do sequencing, or I think people call this like based sequencing. Um, this has MEV implications, and that's sort of the big trade-off is like as soon as you have a decentralized set of sequencers, miners can participate as sequencers, which then means that the incentives are complicated for miners because ideally you want them to just be mining based on Bitcoin incentives, but then they would also be incentivized to mine based on what's happening on the rollup. The advantage of a centralized sequencer is that they are able to like absorb all of the MEV. So there's just one party, and there's no incentives that are sort of passed through to the miners. They just collect all the MEV. Maybe they rebate it back to the users or whatever. They rebate some of it to the miners. Uh, but that element of a rollup is centralized. You can work around it, um, or you can get all of the nice things that you'd want from a system, even though you do have a centralized sequencer. So you can have um, like the ability to take your money out of the rollup, even if the sequencer doesn't cooperate or goes away. You could have forced inclusions, so you can post things on the L1 that the sequencer can't censor. But yeah, I mean, call it a centralized database, I think is a little bit reductive. But there is probably a centralized sequencer, and that is an element of centralization, and it can be eliminated, but it also has trade-offs.
Yeah, I guess the person commenting is happy with your answer. And I also want to talk about bulletproofs and full chain membership proofs because these are actual proposals that can be implemented in Bitcoin. I guess they do require some sort of forking, but they are pretty interesting. Before that, I gotta mention the other two sponsors of the show. One of them is huddling.ch. They are based in Switzerland and they are experts in self-custody. So if you hold a lot of Bitcoin or else you're part of a company that is planning to add some BTC to its balance sheet, they are going to advise you on how to make your setup, how to have a quorum, whether or not you require hardware wallets, how to do a multi-sig, how to back that up, and all sorts of advice. The two guys behind the project are Polto and Darko, and you can listen to them in the previous season of the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. And they also have this service that they can offer to you if you've lost your keys and you only remember some specific details from your seed phrase or about how you did your backup and stuff like this. They can try to help you recover it. So check out huddling.ch. And last but not least, there is NoOnes, which is noones.com. It's an exchange that is peer-to-peer created by Ray from Paxful. That's how he used to be known. Now he's Ray from No One's. His full name is Ray Youssef. He's very committed to onboarding the global south to Bitcoin, and he believes in this mission that money that is sound and exists on the internet should be used to help those who need it the most, not just enrich Silicon Valley and Wall Street guys. So if you want to participate in this peer-to-peer economy, you can sell gift cards or you can just buy and sell stuff in this P2P market. And Ray says that everyone eats, which means that there's a small percentage that everyone makes along the way. So check it out. It's noones.com. It's a peer-to-peer exchange. I guess it can be a fun weekend experiment to see how much money you can make on it. Anyway, we got to talk about the two research papers that have your name on them among the contributors. One of them is Bulletproofs Plus Plus, and there are two versions of it that I can find. One is from a few years ago and has been updated.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also full chain membership proofs, which is a very fancy name for basically having an anonymity set consisting of every participant on the chain, if I'm not mistaken. That's what it means. So you get to choose which one you talk about first.
Sure. I guess I'll talk about Bulletproofs Plus Plus. So people may have heard of Bulletproofs from several authors like Benedict Bunz, and there's also some Blockstream guys. I think Andrew Polstra, Peter Willa, and Greg Maxwell. Boodle. I think Dan Bonet is an author, but anyway, it introduced a kind of a proof system that's based on elliptic curves, but does not have a trusted setup. So people may have heard of trusted setups, like other proof systems have. Groth 16, for example, or Plonk have trusted setups of different types. So Bulletproofs was like a pretty impressive paper. It improved on this earlier technique of Boodle, which did sort of a substantially similar trick and also would have enabled them, but it reduced the proof size by a factor of like 6 or something like that. So yeah, I think the story of Bulletproofs is cool. Like I think that Blockstream sort of approached Dan Bonet and suggested this problem as like something that would have industry application. And so it's kind of an interesting example of very early collaboration between academics and industry, say, or like, the crypto world outside of academia, which has ended up being pretty fruitful. Like Dan has participated in a lot of stuff, and Benedict and others. And so anyway, Bulletproofs Plus Plus is also a proof system that has no trusted setup and is designed for confidential transactions, which is also the problem that Bulletproofs is trying to address. A confidential transaction keeps the amount of money involved for all of the inputs and outputs secret. Bulletproofs primary contribution is introducing this technique called like reciprocal argument. It has come to be called like logup or logarithmic derivatives, and is implemented in like I think most modern kind of proof systems. So like ZKVMs use this, and it's a kind of well, I call it like a multi-set equality check, basically. But we use it for in Bulletproofs which Jonas, Nick, Tim Ruffing, and Sanket Kanjelkar are also authors. So I was with them at Blockstream. I wrote the first version of the paper before joining Blockstream, and then they helped like implement it and like substantially improve the paper. And we ended up submitting it to Eurocrypt where it was accepted. So that's like the history of the paper, but I don't know, it's probably not interesting to people. Anyway, the proofs themselves, they're like 5 times faster to prove, and they're like 400 bytes, something like that, I think, so 300 something bytes. So they're quite small. They're like 30 or 40% smaller than Bulletproofs, and they're like 25% smaller than Bulletproofs Plus. I think the actual numbers are in the paper, so if people are interested. But the really significant improvement is like prover time and verifier time, because Bulletproofs have this unfortunate property that the verifier runs in the same asymptotic time as the prover. So the proof is not like work saving. The proof itself is really small, but it's still takes a while to verify. So this is important for something like confidential transactions where you're putting proofs on chain, like with Mimblewimble or with Liquid, you have to have everybody verify these proofs. Yeah, so the short description of logup. Basically, you have this problem a lot in Snarks where I have a sequence of values, call it A, and another sequence of values B. And I want to check that A is a permutation of B. So I can swap the elements of A somehow and get B. One way to think about this is you want to like forget some of the structure of A and B. You want to forget specifically the ordering information. You only want to keep just the set of things. You don't want to, because then you can just check if the sets are the same. And so logup is a way to do this more efficiently than previous protocols. And it's, yeah, you basically, if you commit to both sequences, then you choose a random value and you check that the sum of 1 over the random value plus each value in A equals the sum of 1 over the random value plus each value in B. And because addition is commutative, the sums will be the same only if the sequences are the same, or they will be the same if the sequences are the same. And because you pick the value randomly, if they're not the same, then the sums will almost certainly not be the same. So you can use this to build like a lookup argument. And this is what we do in Bulletproofs where you check that each digit in a number belongs to some allowed set. So if we were working in base 10, you'd have a list of all the digits, and you want to check that each one is a number from 0 to 9. And then this like logup technique lets us do that. The other cool thing is it lets us check multi-asset transactions. So if you have a bunch of assets coming in and a bunch of assets coming out, you want to make sure that the amount of each asset coming in is the same as the amount going out. And logup lets us do this in a really clean way, or I should say the reciprocal argument, because it's not, logup is like the lookup version, but in the reciprocal argument, like I said, instead of having 2 sequences, now we kind of have sequences of pairs where you have like an amount and a type. And so you put the amount in the numerator and the type in the denominator. And then when you add them up, it just adds up the amounts for every type and keeps them separate. And then on the other side, it adds up the amounts for every type and keeps them separate. And then you can check that they're the same. So this is what Bulletproofs does. And I think it's It's cool. I mean, it is a confidential transaction paper, meaning it does not provide anonymity. Like it doesn't provide any hiding properties for the relationships between transactions. And that's what you get from something like full chain membership proofs, and Zcash, say, right? Like these commit nullify schemes. Yeah, so that's missing from Bulletproofs plus plus, but it's focused on this other aspect. And in a sense, right, like the techniques, maybe not the proof system itself, but the techniques transpose very naturally into a larger proof system, which also hides the, graph.
One of the Zcash community members, Zero Darts, commented on Twitter and said, "Is that your twin brother?"
That's
That's
funny.
funny. Yeah.
That's funny.
Anyway, to simplify your explanation, I will say that Bulletproofs plus plus are basically a way to hide the amounts that you're sending in a transaction. You're not hiding the sender or the receiver, you just
Hmm.
hide what's between them,
Yes,
and
and the
that's the amount of
types,
coins.
the amounts and the types. So if you have Tether and Bitcoin in one transaction, you don't learn that you have like you don't learn that. You only learn that you have some inputs and some outputs.
Oh, now I understand why the Xano people praised you. Okay. They use that too with their confidential assets.
Nice.
So this can be used to hide amounts, but how scalable is it? Because there's always the argument that obfuscation adds up a lot of data and makes
Mm.
transactions much larger in size.
Yeah, I think it scales pretty well. I mean, the proof itself scales logarithmically in the number of inputs, or I say outputs, basically. The way you build a transaction protocol is you need a range proof for every output. And assuming that the inputs come from previous transactions, you don't need range proofs. And then, so it's like 300 plus like 64 times the log of the number of inputs and outputs. So the size of the proof is comparable, maybe a little bit bigger than a normal Bitcoin transaction. And it scales such that if you have bigger transactions, it becomes a small fraction compared to just like, writing down the public keys or something, which scales linearly. It scales better than Bulletproofs, or no, it scales the same as Bulletproofs, but it is concretely smaller than Bulletproofs and Bulletproofs Plus. And another aspect that's important, although difficult, there's some caveats, but it's faster to verify, which is a big deal when you have lots of, say, transactions in a mempool and you want to check which ones of them are valid. And it also supports batch verification like Bulletproofs. Um, so, I mean, like as it stands, I believe Liquid still has the old like Borromean ring signature confidential transactions. So compared to that, Bulletproofs plus plus are dramatically smaller and faster, like a factor of 5 or 10 smaller.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Are these Bulletproofs plus plus implemented in Monero right now? Or are they
I
just
don't.
the normal ones, the Bulletproofs?
I think in Monero right now they have Bulletproofs Plus, which was an improvement over Bulletproofs. Bulletproofs plus plus, there was some interest, I think, a while ago, but I think at this point they're just doing full chain membership proofs, which kind of render this sort of proof system obsolete, or like in the sense that you just do the full chain membership proof and it would include inside of it something like a confidential transaction as part of what you're proving. So no, it's not implement, or I think there's an implementation, but it's not like deployed in Monero, and I don't think there's any intention to do so.
Okay, so what about full chain membership proofs? What are they and why are they such a big deal? Because Monero people are so excited about this. They say it will finally work much better than it did with ring signatures and decoy addresses and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So full chain membership proofs bring to Monero the same level of privacy you get from Zcash, like Halo 2 or the older Zcash protocols. So the way it basically okay, so I'm also not an expert on exactly how full chain membership proofs work, but the broad structure of how these kinds of protocols work is every transaction has some list of outputs, and these outputs are added to a big tree, and then it has some list of inputs. For each input, you need to prove that it corresponds to some output in the tree. So it's basically a Merkle inclusion proof for this big accumulator of all of the previous outputs. What this means is that you have perfect privacy for that input amongst all of the outputs of every previous transaction or every transaction before some time. This is in contrast to a ring signature where you specify some small relative to the total set number of outputs and you say it's one of these. Ring signatures, so I mean like I think the classical argument is that you can like say spend it several times and then your potential candidate set grows larger as it grows exponential in the depth. But with a full chain membership proof, you just get sort of the best possible privacy for your input immediately. It's simpler, easier to use, cheaper, all these things. And uh, Yeah, so you prove that your input corresponds to an output, and then you also prove knowledge of a nullifier, or I don't know if what they call them in Monero, but it's the same thing. People call it different things. The nullifier is essentially like a hash, basically, of some sort of secret associated with your the input that you're spending, and it's deterministic. So there's exactly one nullifier for each previous transaction output. You reveal the nullifier and you prove that it's valid. When you reveal the nullifier, this is what prevents double spends. Because if you try to spend, or like if you sort of think about it a little bit, privacy and double spend resistance are kind of in tension. Because like I don't want to reveal which output I'm spending, but if I don't reveal any information about which output I'm spending, then I could spend the same output twice, because then you can't tell, right? So the nullifier solves this problem. It's some deterministic data that's derived from the output, but doesn't reveal which output it is. It's kind of like a hash. And you publish the nullifier, and these nullifiers are also accumulated on chain. And every node checks that when they're given a new transaction, it has the proofs of membership, it has all the nullifiers, it checks that the nullifiers are not already published, so it checks there's no double spends. It verifies the proof, which proves that each input is a valid output, right? And because the nullifier hasn't been published and because the input is a valid output, we know that that input is in the UTXO set, right? Because the nullifiers is like the spent transaction outputs, and the set you're proving inclusion into is like all of the transaction outputs. So the difference of these sets is the unspent transaction outputs. Um, So the bulk of this, the proof is like proving these Merkle inclusion proofs and some other stuff. And my understanding of the full chain membership proofs that like Luke and others have been working on is that they're using a paper I wrote about like proving elliptic curve operations in circuit as part of the proof system. So I think that's probably my contribution to the full chain membership proof stuff. I haven't really done that much with it. It's mostly just this piece.
Okay, so do you believe that Bitcoin could get full chain membership proofs and bulletproofs?
So I mean, I don't know, maybe, right? Things are hard to predict, but the one of the motivations for working on shielded CSV was feeling like that was unlikely to happen. Um, One of the downsides of the approach that Monero and Zcash and others have is they put the proofs on chain. And by putting the proofs on chain, they require a lot of data. I mean, like the proofs themselves are like a couple of kilobytes. So it's bigger than a Bitcoin transaction. If you don't increase the block size, this would reduce the amount of transactions you can perform by a lot. There are advantages over shielded CSV. I think I mentioned last time, or I have mentioned in the past, like shielded CSV requires that clients like communicate data one way out of band, which is not strictly necessary for like a full chain membership proof design. But I think short answer, probably no, not natively via like a fork. It just seems politically, I mean, I'd love it. I think it'd be great, but it's pretty far outside of the Overton window. I mean, we're talking about something like cat not being activated because it's too complicated or speculative, and something full chain membership proofs are just a whole other level of complexity. I think this is a place where the like old line about letting other coins experiment with features makes sense because, well, another issue is enshrining the proof system, right? Bitcoin, it'd be very hard, probably impossible to enshrine a proof system in the chain, like as part of consensus. Whereas in Monero, this is already the case, so it totally makes sense. Yeah, so I think with shielded CSV and a bridge, we can get the same level of privacy. It's a little bit unwieldy, like, or it's a little bit more complicated in the sense that there's like two steps, but yeah, that is, in my opinion, the most viable path towards bringing privacy to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I guess the classic argument against this is that people will not be able to look at the blockchain and understand if there's any hidden inflation. And
Mm-hmm.
that is
This
the
is your
biggest
concern.
concern. And how
Yeah.
how do you explain to people that cannot happen, or do you think that this is a possibility?
Yeah, it's always a risk, right? If you have like basically in systems where you have, instead of the amounts directly on chain, um, you have commitments to the amounts that are hiding and secret. Um, there's always a risk that your proof system like has a bug, basically. And this has happened. Zcash had an inflation bug in their like old version. Um, I think other people have. I mean, certainly, yeah. So it's always a risk. The I think probably like the mitigation that makes the most sense for Bitcoin is to have a shielded pool. And so you can opt in to this risk. If you want privacy, first of all, if you want privacy, this risk is unavoidable. Like you must adopt the risk. But if you are willing to accept it, then you opt into the shielded pool, which, maybe isn't great. Maybe we like it if everything was private. But if you want to protect against hidden inflation, then all the hidden inflation happens within the shielded pool. And if there is hidden inflation, maybe someone can drain the whole shielded pool and steal everybody's money, but it only affects the people who opted into the system. So yeah, that's I think probably the best you can do. I think it's also worth pointing out that the proof systems have matured over time. I mean, everything should be treated with a great deal of scrutiny, but like, um, you know, the likelihood of inflation bugs should go down over time, right? It's still high. People are still developing, or it's not high, but it's non-zero. It's something you should be aware of and concerned about and take seriously. But over time, it becomes less likely.
Yeah, and I guess we should remember that also Matt Corallo inserted an inflation bug in Bitcoin by changing something trivial, just trying to make this 5% optimization.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the nice thing about an inflation bug, though, in normal Bitcoin is that it is recoverable, or well, I mean, is in principle recoverable, whereas in a privacy system, or it's detectable and recoverable. In a privacy coin, it's really not detectable. I mean, it probably would eventually be detectable, right? If I printed 10 to the 80 Monero and just started like giving it to people, people would notice, but it's not recoverable. So it's different, but yeah, I mean, you can always have bugs.
There are two questions in the chat right now. One is from Longstats, wants to know what's the paper you're referencing that highlights running sequencers with mining equipment. I'd like to read this material, thanks in advance.
I think the term you should search for is based sequencing, like BASED sequencing. Um, I don't it'll probably be mostly Ethereum focused, but I don't have like a good paper on hand or off the top of my head. I would say just search for that and see where it takes you.
It sounds like the only kind of sequencing I would enjoy. The based type, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, the other question, and it's also sort of a suggestion. Maybe I should do this. I don't know. So Satoshi Spirit says, can we ask every guest if Bitcoin should increase the block size and keep running the poll for all guests to answer? So do you believe Bitcoin should increase the block size? Not now, maybe in the future or sometimes.
I recently had my perspective changed about this, or actually, I don't know if it changed, but a different way of framing the problem. I think, yes, the Bitcoin block size should probably increase like in the future broadly. Um, but I think what matters more than the Bitcoin block size is the Bitcoin like node validation overhead. So the I think the real issue with increasing the block size isn't the data per se. It's like the overhead, right? If we made the Bitcoin block 1 GB, then the number of computers that could verify blocks um, within a certain amount of time would drop dramatically, and it would harm decentralization. Um, so strategies that make Bitcoin blocks take less time to verify should sort of enable block size increases without harming decentralization, or up to a point. Um, so yeah, I think the Bitcoin block size should be increased eventually, and that Bitcoin block validation time matters more than the block size. And um, more exotic proposals like rolling up all the signatures into a Stark and then just verifying that would make Bitcoin block validation much faster and therefore potentially enable larger blocks with no effect on decentralization. But it's also an empirical question, right? Like the reason why you don't want to increase the block size is decentralization and cost of being a miner, which you want to keep low. So I think we can increase the block size without harming those things, or like keeping them in an acceptable range.
I can tell that you're not working for Blockstream anymore. Because otherwise you'd say, no, that's horrible. It's a scam. You should use Liquid.
No, I don't. I mean, it's been a long time since that. I wonder. I wonder. Yeah.
But there's a lot to be said because back in 2017, when this narrative was created that we should never increase the block size and SegWit was just good enough, you have to understand that the average internet speed was much lower, storage was more expensive, and there are fewer users of Bitcoin who are interested in running nodes. Now you have more nodes, you have cheaper storage, and you have much faster internet. You have services like Starlink. Because always, when you say, internet is much faster today, there's gonna be that one guy who's gonna say, yeah, but in this village in Africa, they don't even have internet access. And now we have Starlink, okay? And of
Yeah.
course, the same person is gonna say that they cannot afford it. But with Starlink, you can have from any place in the world very fast internet access, right? If you're not happy that this person cannot access the internet at a fast enough speed, you can actually pay for it. You can pay for someone to use the internet that way. Or you can wait a few years and it's gonna become more competitive. There's gonna be a wider market for this and you're gonna have cheaper satellite internet so that anyone can actually access the internet with broadband speeds or 5G or whatever you set the standard as. And at that point, it makes no sense. It becomes just some sort of religion, this of keeping the block size small. Of course, I do believe that Bitcoin should scale in layers. And we're going to get pretty good layer twos. We're going to get sidechains, rollups, and whatever. But you do want users to be able to unilaterally enter and exit these layers. Because if they cannot, then you're going to go back to the trusted situation that I guess Bitcoin was made to solve. And you do want everyone to be able to hold their own keys, and that's another problem because you have more users than the capacity for Bitcoin to process transactions. You have a lot of them on exchanges. And can Bitcoin actually handle a mass withdrawal? We do like to say that January the 3rd is proof of keys when everyone should withdraw their coins from exchanges. But is there actual capacity for that to happen? And that's another question.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I agree. The point, in my view, of small blocks or not making blocks arbitrarily large is decentralization. You want to make sure that Bitcoin doesn't become Solana or something, and we're very far from that. And uh, yeah, so with that in mind, I think increasing the block size makes sense.
Yeah, and I feel sorry that BSV sort of destroyed any credibility for increasing the
Hmm.
block size, because it was such a shit show and it was such an easy target to point at and say, oh, look at them. It was always a bad idea. It was so obvious. But Bitcoin Cash only has, I think, 32 megabytes
Well,
and has been
I don't
like
know.
this. I think they enabled dynamic block size now, but
Hmm.
they were more conservative and they followed what was described as Bitcoin Classic and Unlimited and stuff like that, which
Hmm.
was proposed for the Bitcoin community before it split. But there's a question in the chat, and I've actually had this thought in the shower at one point that maybe we can reach a consensus and have some sort of hybrid proof of work, proof of stake system in Bitcoin where you also incentivize node operators to keep their node running and give them some sort of reward and have a few blocks a day being proof of stake being given to the people who run nodes or something like this. But the question in the chat is from Zoidberg, and he says, what is your opinion on switching Bitcoin to proof of stake? Do you think it's likely to happen in some time in the future?
I think it is not likely that Bitcoin will switch to proof of stake. Um, I th- so I'm not like a consensus person really, or not an expert in these things, but from what I understand, proof of stake systems tend to be very complicated. I mean, there's like a nice kind of simplicity to proof of work, especially Bitcoin, which is, I think most people would agree, pretty easy to understand. Simple, like evidently works pretty well. Um, yeah, I mean, I think the arguments for proof of stake are, well, I don't know. I don't personally find them very compelling. But who knows, right? Maybe um or like I don't know. I don't actually know how they do it, but like if like the data availability sampling things from like Celestia or Avail or whatever like reward clients for doing that, I don't know. I mean, these things are fun to think about, but for me, these things, this is where the concerns about affecting Bitcoin are more more at least for me, because I don't understand a lot of this stuff. I would treat this with a lot of skepticism. Maybe it's just because I already know how snarks sort of work and have a pretty good grasp of them that I don't feel like that's as big a change. But changing the consensus system of Bitcoin is a very, very big change. I mean, Ethereum has it went through like a very long, complicated process to make this work. And, there's all sorts of cryptography that's been researched and trying to make it work, VDFs, where we're going to use them and then they're not going to use them. Yeah, so um, I I I would be very surprised if Bitcoin adopted proof of proof of stake or even a hybrid system like you were describing your shower thought. But they're interesting to consider. Maybe one of them, I mean, in principle, if there were some like magical consensus system that delivered the same kinds of guarantees as proof of work and was like didn't require work, that would be very cool. I mean, I'd be very interested in that, but that's not really the status quo. So it's yeah.
Yeah, this is maybe beyond our lifetime, but once the block reward runs out, it's gonna be interesting to see if there's enough demand for block space to keep the miners going. Or mining
Mm,
is gonna revert from its industrial scale and become more of a hobbyist activity. And it's gonna be basically you're gonna have the network secured by the people who own enough Bitcoin to care about its security and want their transactions to be included in blocks, but it's not profitable anymore. Who knows? But I do see, our kids will have to figure this out and establish their own consensus about what Bitcoin is and whether or not proof of stake is a good idea at that point.
mm. Yeah, or I mean, other kinds of exotic changes like tail emission or something would probably end up being seriously considered at that point.
Yeah, I think that's a much more radical breach of the social contract in Bitcoin because everyone seems to
Yeah.
agree on the 21 million cap. I think it's the most powerful meme that you have in Bitcoin right now, the limited supply. And once you break that and you prove that you've created a precedent where you have broken that, I don't know, maybe the project is not as valuable anymore.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's true. It is kind of the central tenet of Bitcoin. You could kind of do demurrage or something like and then rebate that as a continual block subsidy, but I don't know. Yeah, these are questions that people probably should consider, but they seem, at least right now, to be a bit longer term.
I mean, you gotta get BlackRock onboarded, right? You gotta sell them some
Huh.
idea. You gotta get your local politician also to, have bullish speeches about Bitcoin and run for office
Mhm.
accepting Bitcoin donations. I think we're
Mhm.
at this point in adoption where they're trying to make it omnious, and then we're gonna talk about the issues more seriously. If ever.
Mhm.
I don't know. Maybe that talking about the issues in Bitcoin will always be some sort of ivory tower activity, while everyone else will just celebrate perfect money and the invention of the first truly honest and transparent form of money ever. Even though I'm
Well,
not very happy about the transparency part. To me, this privacy problem in Bitcoin is not really about privacy because there is no privacy. There's just deniability. You can say, well, it wasn't me, it was someone else. But the more
uh,
time passes and the more information gets added to uh, an old UTXO, the more you actually know about what happened. And it only takes one mistake where you maybe join some KYC exchange or you send to the wrong person and that person doxes you, or there's gonna be some sort of event where you're gonna break all of your good practices from the past, and there's gonna be linking directly to your old wallet, and who knows where that's going to lead. So even if you have perfectly good deniability today in Bitcoin, the advancements in blockchain analysis and the possibility that you're going to make a mistake are much worse. And you can still maintain perfect practices, but someone who sent you a transaction at one point may not. And it's just like your phone number. Maybe that you don't want to give your phone number to everyone, but
Yeah,
then one person who has your phone number is going to leak it somehow. And it's not private anymore.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And having the ability to use snarks or something does like prevent this catastrophic information leakage, right? Because then you can't even like everything is sort of individually and atomically deniable, right? You don't learn any information from new things that are posted.
Do you believe in a Bitcoin only world where everything is going to be divided by 21 million coins? Or do you think it's always gonna be multi chain, and maybe that some of today's chains will be just like the Visa and the MasterCard, some alternative that you have for the payments that you make?
I don't know. I mean, I treat this as empirical. I wouldn't be prescriptive about it. I don't think that so I guess there's like different forks in the road. Um, I think that assuming Alpen and others are successful in creating Bitcoin L2s, it will draw a lot of attention, especially from people that want to use Bitcoin for ideological reasons, or because they want to use it like as a collateral or like get yield on it or like all of these kinds of things. Like so there will be a lot of interest that comes to Bitcoin from Ethereum and other places. I think that like something like Solana is interesting because if you're willing to kind of bite the bullet and trade off decentralization for performance, that clearly some people find that compelling. So maybe there are like philosophical differences that will just never be reconciled, and there's some barrier that like even with snarks and whatever fancy stuff you want to conjure up, you'll never be able to compete with somebody who just doesn't care about decentralization. So maybe they will continue to exist forever. Um, I don't know. I think it's possible that a world where Bitcoin exists will, or where Bitcoin, I mean, I don't think other coins will go away completely unless they make trading meme coins illegal. Like people seem to enjoy doing that, so that they'll always exist. For something like Ethereum, it's interesting. I don't know. I think its future it's difficult for me to predict right now. Um, Something like Zcash and Monero, I mean, they continue to provide privacy. People actually use them for payments, and so that they'll continue to exist. But I don't know. I don't know. I do also. I will say I don't know. I think forms of forms of like credit money will probably exist. So like whether or not you think that that's Bitcoin is um like well I guess it wouldn't be. It'd be some kind of like weird kind of debt instrument that's backed by Bitcoin. People might use that for cash instead of Bitcoin because being deflationary, people are disincentivized to actually use Bitcoin to like do a lot of purchases. So maybe some kind of like derivative stable coin thing. Oh yeah, stable coins also, right? Like maybe in the very, very long term, countries cease to exist and we just have Bitcoin. But for the time being, I don't expect stable coins will go anywhere, and the demand for them will only go up. So, uh, kind of a hedgy answer, but I really don't know.
I really don't like the term stablecoin because it entails that there is stability when in fact you're just creating an asset that is a digital representation of something which is just as volatile as everything else and might as well go to zero.
Sure. Maybe it's stable with respect to this other volatile thing. They vary the same. But yeah, 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 I see what you mean.
So here's the classic question. Where do you see Bitcoin in 10 years? You think it will remain the same and we will still fight about upcat and other maybe improved covenant upcodes? Or do you believe that we're going to build some significant stuff that will change the way in which we understand it and use it every day?
Yeah, I mean the reason why I decided to work at Alpen is because I think Bitcoin L2s have a real chance of like working and making a difference. And assuming that works, Bitcoin L2s will enable scalability and privacy with Bitcoin that is not possible today. So I think that the landscape could change quite a bit. A lot of like what I think of as like the original spirit, like people actually doing payments privately with Bitcoin will hopefully come back. And 10 years, I think that will either have worked or not. Um, there's also like, I guess it's a little bit non-technical, but like the effects of the ETFs and the potential friendliness or not of big governments to Bitcoin will probably make 2034 look a lot different than 2024. Um, there are a lot of people who own a lot of Bitcoin that are not interested in privacy and in fact are strongly opposed to it. And so I think that that conflict will play out at some level. Countries could buy Bitcoin, you know, I mean, who knows, all of these things. I suspect in 10 years, things will look quite a bit different in terms of how people use Bitcoin. I think that there's been a bit of a lull in terms of like, you know, what I would like to see, but from privacy and you know, scalability and all that, and over the last however many years. So hopefully that changes, and it feels like it has. Like the vibe has changed quite a bit, I think. Like people seriously talking about activating cat, I would have not happened a few years ago, I think.
Yeah, but people also have expectations when they talk about activation and they set arbitrary goals and they say, you know, we got to get it done by the end of the year or by next year or something.
Mm.
And then you also have the taproot wizards who maybe are helping with spreading awareness about cat, but at the same time, they're also triggering all the wrong people.
Mm.
And then you're going to get these quote unquote defenders of Bitcoin saying, you know, this is an attack by VCs and shitcoiners, and they're trying to radically change the way that we use and understand Bitcoin. And once again, it's shitcoin tech. You don't want this. Just use the holy tools that were endowed to you by Satoshi and Blockstream.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the taproot wizards are definitely inflammatory and get the people going, you might say. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I think the arbitrary deadline things is more an artifact of companies, right? You know, the nice thing about something like Bitcoin is that it should outlive individual companies, right? You know, it is decentralized. There's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people have different incentives, and so one company can't really force anything, even a big company, even a company that people have heard of that really wants some specific change in some specific time frame. That's good. You know, it provides stability to the system. So, but in 10 years is a long time. I think that cat either will have happened or will not have happened in 10 years. I, I don't see many worlds where cat takes 20 years to activate. That doesn't really make sense to me.
Well, we shall see. In principle, I told you, I'm very much in favor of keeping builders on Bitcoin and advancing protocols to the point where they can actually compete. Because right now, I think there was too much emphasis on Lightning and there was a lot of hope that it's gonna finally work and it's gonna become the scaling layer that everyone onboards. I don't think it played out as expected, and I'm quite disappointed that the attempts to make it more efficient also brought more centralization and more
Mm.
custodians. And once you get to that point, it's sort of useless when you think about it.
Yeah, I certainly don't want more custodians and more centralization. So yeah,
There's a
yeah,
comment in the chat saying that the wizard think they are white knights in digital armor protecting Bitcoin's purity and virgin status.
that's funny.
There was also someone who said in the comments of this video on Twitter, he said CTRLC, CTRLV. Like we're just copy paste version of each
Oh,
other because we look alike a bit.
yeah, I guess the crypto people have a look.
Not really. Like I can't think of. Wait, if Super Testnet lost some weight, maybe we could look a bit like each other.
I haven't seen him in a while. He had longer hair. I have gotten the Polstra comparison a few times.
But he's
Yeah,
shorter and he's more skinny than you are.
yeah, yeah. Well, we also used to both work at Blockstream, so it's funny.
Did
So
anyone ever call you Andrew?
no, no, no. Everybody there knew, but yeah, it's funny.
Thank you very much, Liam, for your time.
Mm,
I
thank
think
you.
I sort of ran out of questions at this point, which is unfortunate because you're a treasure. I enjoy listening to you.
Oh, that's nice. I appreciate it.
And I like that you're honest. You don't have, at least not that I can tell, you don't have an agenda. You're not trying to sell me anything. You're telling it how it is. And that's exactly what I want on this show.
mm, yeah, no, I don't. I mean, I guess my like wanting snarks on Bitcoin for privacy is an agenda, but it's not really selling. It's just, but yeah, yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, where can people keep up with your work, learn
Mm.
more about what you're doing?
I am on Twitter. It's just my name, Liam Eagen, Eagen. The ePrint, but where the papers go. I think Alpen puts out stuff too, so it's good to follow them. They're a bit more social media savvy. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm not that. You can email me too. I you, I don't think it's that hard to figure out what my email address is. So, but yeah, that I don't know. I try to be pretty responsive, but I don't post so much on Twitter.
Okay. And I would like to thank the sponsors once again SideShift, Citrea, Layer 2 Labs, No Once, and Huddling.ch. Thank you to everyone who commented and was active during this live stream. I hope that I answered your questions or Liam has answered your questions because honestly, you don't really care what I think. You already know. And what else? Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.